They thought they could silence me, dismiss me as if I didn't belong. But what they didn't know was that I'm not just another passenger, I'm Monica Davis, Chief Legal Officer of Atlantic Air. When their prejudice tried to ground me, I stood tall. This isn't just my story, it's a fight for dignity, justice, and the right to claim every space I've earned. My journey starts here. Will you follow? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The soft hum of the city waking up had always calmed me. It reminded me of the steady rhythm I had worked hard to maintain in my life. Today was no different, or so I thought. As I sipped my coffee, my mind was already on the meeting ahead. The stakes were high, but I'd been here before. Decades of battling boardrooms had taught me that pressure could be an ally when wielded properly. As I dressed, I thought of my mother, whose words always felt more like armor than advice. Always walk with your head high, even when others try to pull you down. My tailored navy suit and silk blouse were more than professional attire, they were a declaration of my confidence, even if the world sometimes questioned it. The airport was its usual chaotic self, families embracing, harried business travelers rushing past, and the low drone of announcements blending into a soundtrack of organized frenzy. Clutching my carry-on, I moved through the throng with practiced ease. I had done this 100 times before, and yet, something about today felt different. Not foreboding exactly, but as though the air carried a charge waiting to snap. Gate 27 loomed ahead. A glance told me everything I needed to know about the woman standing behind the counter. Her tight bun, rigid posture, and eyes scanning every passenger with a subtle air of judgment spoke volumes. Her name tag read Miss Andrews, but her face screamed that she had already categorized me. I handed over my boarding pass with a polite smile, my voice smooth and professional. Good afternoon. Her eyes flicked up for the briefest moment before narrowing. She took the ticket from my hand but didn't scan it. Something in her expression shifted, disapproval mixed with suspicion. It was a look I had seen before, one I thought I had left behind years ago. As I waited, I noticed a young girl nearby holding her mother's hand. Her wide-eyed curiosity reminded me of a much younger version of myself. Her gaze darted between me and Miss Andrews, as though sensing something brewing in the air. I gave her a small smile, hoping to reassure her. Miss Andrews' voice pulled me back to the present. One moment, she said curtly, disappearing behind the counter. My ticket remained unscanned, and I felt a flicker of unease. But I brushed it off. This was just another routine flight, and I had no reason to believe otherwise. Yet, the unease that flickered inside me turned into something heavier as Miss Andrews returned. She held my boarding pass at arm's length, her lips pressed tight. Her voice, sharp and loud enough to carry across the gate area, cut through the airport hum. This doesn't look right. Heads turned. Conversations stilled. I felt the heat of curious eyes on me, weighing, judging. For a moment, I stood motionless, processing her words. Then I straightened, letting calm professionalism coat my voice. There must be a mistake, I said, careful to keep my tone even. This ticket is valid. If you check the system, you'll see my reservation. Miss Andrews didn't move toward her computer. Instead, she tilted her head, her smirk deepening. We get a lot of these, you know, people trying to sneak into first class when they don't belong. Her words hit me like a slap. My heart raced, not with fear but with a building indignation that I fought to control. Years of navigating spaces where I wasn't expected to excel had taught me how to mask these emotions. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I assure you, I belong here, I said evenly, sliding my ID and receipt from my carry-on. This ticket is legitimate. Miss Andrews didn't bother to glance at the documents I handed her. Instead, she turned her attention to the growing line of passengers, some of whom were now openly whispering. I caught fragments, "What's going on?" and she must have done something wrong. My stomach tightened, but I stood my ground. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a young girl, the same one I had smiled at earlier. Her wide-eyed gaze locked onto me, her tiny hand clutching her mother's fingers. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. That little girl was watching, and she deserved to see that we don't shrink in the face of baseless judgment. Miss Andrews huffed. "I'll need to call security." "Do what you need to," I replied, my voice sharp but steady. "But I would appreciate it if you treated me with the same courtesy you've shown the other passengers." Her smirk didn't falter, but her cheeks flushed. She barked a few words into her radio, and within moments, 2 security officers appeared. The taller of the two, a man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. His badge read, "Officer Tyler." "What seems to be the issue here?" Tyler asked, glancing between Miss Andrews and me. Miss Andrews wasted no time. "This passenger is attempting to board with what I believe is a fraudulent ticket," she declared, her tone dripping with exaggerated authority. I tilted my head, meeting her gaze with calm defiance. "I've provided all the necessary documentation. My ID, my receipt. Everything is in order." Officer Tyler looked at me, then at Miss Andrews. "May I see the documents?" he asked, his voice neutral but cautious. I handed them over, feeling a wave of quiet determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about challenging the very assumptions that led us to this moment. As Officer Tyler studied the papers, the whispers among the passengers grew louder. I could feel the weight of their judgments, their silent questions. Was I lying? Was I a criminal? Did I deserve to be there? Tyler's voice cut through the murmurs. "Everything checks out," he said, handing the documents back to me. I allowed myself a small breath of relief, but it was short-lived. Miss Andrews crossed her arms, her lips curling into a smug sneer. "Well, I still think it's suspicious. How often do we see someone like her in first class?" Her words hung in the air like poison. My chest tightened, but I refused to let her see the impact. Years of coded language, veiled insults, and microaggressions had prepared me for this moment. I wouldn't let her win. "Miss Andrews," I said, my voice firm but calm, "I suggest you reconsider your tone. You're not just questioning my ticket, you're questioning my integrity." Miss Andrews smirked, her satisfaction evident. "Please step aside, ma'am. We need to confirm with the gate manager." I stepped out of line, my carry-on clutched tightly. The crowd shifted, some passengers averting their gaze, others openly staring. I felt their judgment as if it were a tangible weight, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I observed as Miss Andrews waved through the next passenger, a white man in a rumpled suit. His boarding pass barely warranted a glance. The inequality of it all burned. But I knew better than to let my anger dictate my actions. My power came from precision, from knowing when to strike and when to wait. And as I stood there, waiting for the gate manager to arrive, I resolved that I wouldn't just board this plane, I would make sure Miss Andrews and everyone watching understood the gravity of what had just transpired. The young girl caught my eye again. Her mother pulled her along, but she kept looking back at me, her expression a mix of curiosity and confusion. I straightened my posture, hoping she saw more than just a woman being questioned. I hoped she saw someone standing tall, unyielding. The gate area buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation. And as the minutes dragged on, I realized this wasn't just about proving my right to a seat in first class. This was about standing up for a principle that no one had the right to question. The minutes stretched unbearably long as I stood to the side, my boarding pass clutched in one hand and my carry-on in the other. Conversations continued around me, but I could feel the tension in the air, muted whispers, sidelong glances, and a quiet curiosity that turned every passenger into an uninvited spectator. The young girl I'd noticed earlier passed me with her mother, her wide-eyed gaze fixed on me. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face was enough. I felt the silent weight of her question, why are they treating her like this? That look was the spark I needed to stay composed. If I was standing in this spotlight, I would make it count. Finally, the gate manager arrived. His name tag read Benson, and he wore a crisp navy suit that looked slightly too large for his wiry frame. His expression betrayed unease as he took in the scene, Miss Andrews looking triumphant, the security officers standing awkwardly, and me, composed but radiating quiet defiance. "What seems to be the issue here?" Benson asked, his tone more neutral than I'd expected. Miss Andrews jumped in before I could speak. "This passenger presented a first-class ticket that I believe is fraudulent. Security has confirmed her documents, but I thought it best to escalate." Her tone dripped with self-righteousness, as if she were heroically protecting the airline from some grand deception. I stepped forward, my voice steady and measured. "Good afternoon, Mr. Benson. My name is Monica Davis. I've provided my ID, my receipt, and my boarding pass, all of which have been validated by security. Yet Miss Andrews continues to question my right to be here." Benson hesitated, glancing at the documents in my hand. "Miss Andrews, if the documents check out." "She doesn't act like a first-class passenger," Miss Andrews interrupted, her voice tinged with incredulity. "I'm just doing my job, but this doesn't add up." The air seemed to grow heavier with her words, their meaning impossible to ignore. This wasn't about my ticket. It wasn't about protocol. It was about the way I looked, the assumptions she'd made the moment I approached the gate. My chest tightened, but I refused to let my composure slip. Instead, I addressed Benson directly, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Mr. Benson, I understand the importance of security and protocol, but I also believe in fairness. What I've experienced here today is far from that." Benson shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between me and Miss Andrews. "Miss Andrews," he said carefully, "if security has confirmed the ticket, there's no reason to." "I still think it's suspicious," Miss Andrews interjected, her voice rising. "How often do we see someone like her in first class?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. I felt the heat of embarrassment creep up my neck, but I wouldn't let her see it. I'd faced comments like this before, each one a reminder that no matter how far I'd climbed, there would always be those who doubted I belonged. Benson cleared his throat, visibly uneasy. "Miss Andrews, let's handle this professionally." "It's already been handled unprofessionally," I said, my voice colder now, the edge of my anger breaking through. "Mr. Benson, I expect to board this plane, but I also expect accountability for what's happened here. This isn't just about me. This is about the principle of how your passengers are treated." Benson nodded, though his hesitation was clear. "You're absolutely right, Miss Davis. I apologize for the inconvenience. Please, allow me to personally escort you onto the plane." I could have taken the easy out then, accepted his apology and moved on. But as I looked at Miss Andrews, still radiating defiance, I knew this moment demanded more. "With all due respect, Mr. Benson," I said, my voice steady but resolute, "this isn't just an inconvenience. It's a symptom of a larger problem. I'm not interested in an apology. I'm interested in solutions." Benson's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. We'll address this immediately." Miss Andrews opened her mouth to speak, but I turned to her, meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve. "You accused me of fraud without evidence, disregarded my documentation, and implied I don't belong here based on nothing but your assumptions. That is not professionalism. That is prejudice." Her face flushed crimson, but she said nothing. Around us, the crowd was silent now, the tension palpable. I turned back to Benson. "I'll be boarding this flight, Mr. Benson. But this conversation isn't over." Benson nodded, his posture stiff but respectful. Understood, Miss Davis. As I followed him toward the jet bridge, I glanced back briefly. The young girl was still watching, her eyes wide and curious. I gave her a small, reassuring smile, hoping she understood that standing up for yourself wasn't just about the moment, it was about paving the way for others. And as I stepped onto the plane, I resolved that this wasn't just about today. This was about tomorrow, and the changes I would ensure came with it. As the cool air of the jet bridge washed over me, I felt my resolve harden. Mr. Benson walked a step ahead, his posture tense, but I had no intention of letting this moment end quietly. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about accountability, about standing against something far bigger than a gate agent's bias. Miss Davis, Benson said once we reached the plane's entrance, his voice soft. Again, I apologize for what just happened. It's unacceptable. His words were well-meaning, but I knew their weight was hollow unless backed by action. I turned to him, keeping my voice calm but firm. Mr. Benson, do you know who I am? He blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. I know your name. I'm Monica Davis, Chief Legal Officer of Atlantic Air, I said, letting the words hang in the air. His face shifted instantly, the realization dawning like a thunderclap. I continued, my tone unwavering. The company you represent is mine to protect, both legally and ethically. What happened at Gate 27 goes against everything we claim to stand for. And now, you and I have a responsibility to address it. Benson's mouth opened, then closed again. His expression wavered between panic and determination. Miss Davis, I assure you, this will be handled. I gave a small, mirthless smile. Good. Because it will be handled by me. I turned back toward the passengers filing into the cabin. Some avoided my gaze entirely, while others watched with muted curiosity. Among them, I spotted the young girl from earlier. She was still holding her mother's hand, and her wide eyes were fixed on me. I offered her a brief, reassuring smile, and her face lit up with something that looked like hope. My seat was in first class, of course. As I stowed my carry-on and sat down, the weight of the last hour began to settle. My pulse was steady, but my thoughts churned. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned my place in a room, or in this case, a plane. But it was the first time I held the power to turn that doubt into something meaningful. The businessman in the seat across the aisle leaned toward me cautiously. Glad you made it on, he said in a low voice, offering a sheepish smile. So am I replied, my tone polite but distant. I didn't owe him anything, not an explanation, not gratitude, but his small gesture was still appreciated. For the first few minutes, I sat silently, staring at the polished leather armrest of my seat. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, offering pre-departure drinks, but I declined. Instead, I pulled my tablet from my bag. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that preparation was the best antidote to anger. As the plane taxied down the runway, I began drafting an internal memo to Atlantic Air's board of directors. I outlined every detail of what had just happened, the baseless accusations, the veiled racism, and the systemic failure that allowed someone like Miss Andrews to act unchecked. I knew this wasn't just about one employee. It was about a culture that needed to change, and I intended to lead that charge. The businessman leaned toward me again, his voice cautious. I don't mean to interrupt, but, are you someone important? I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head slightly. Depends on who you ask, I replied, my tone light. Why do you ask? He hesitated before replying. The way you handled that back there. I've never seen someone keep their cool like that. And then the gate manager, you could see him trip over himself when he realized who you were. I studied him for a moment, debating how much to say. Finally, I replied, I'm the chief legal officer for this airline. Unfortunately, situations like that aren't new to me. But what caused it? That's something I won't tolerate. His eyebrows shot up. Chief Legal Officer? That explains a lot. I nodded, glancing out the window as the plane climbed higher into the clouds. It explains why I didn't back down, I said softly. But it shouldn't take a title to be treated with dignity. His expression grew serious, and he leaned back in his seat. You're right. And honestly, I wouldn't want to be in that gate agent's shoes right now. I gave him a faint smile, but my focus had already shifted. This wasn't about retribution, it was about accountability. And as the plane leveled out, I felt the clarity of my purpose solidify. This fight wasn't just mine. It was for everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. The hum of the engines provided a soothing rhythm, but my thoughts were anything but calm. I stared at the tablet resting on my tray table, the screen still glowing with the half-written draft of my memo. Every detail of the incident replayed in my mind, each word and action sharpening the resolve building in my chest. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing the emotions to surface briefly: anger, frustration, and the quiet ache of knowing this wasn't the first time I'd been judged for simply existing in spaces I had earned. But as the familiar sting rose, I thought of my mother. Her voice, clear as day: strength doesn't mean holding back your anger, it means knowing where to put it. When I opened my eyes, I felt a renewed focus. My anger wasn't a burden, it was fuel. I resumed typing, the words flowing as I documented the series of events with precision. The accusations, the refusal to acknowledge my documentation, the loaded remark about people like me, each piece was a puzzle that formed a larger picture of systemic failure. The flight attendant stopped by, her smile professional but tinged with curiosity. "Is there anything I can get you, Miss Davis?" "No, thank you," I replied, offering her a polite smile. She lingered for a second longer, as if deciding whether to say more. Then, in a quieter tone, she added, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened back at the gate. I heard about it, and it wasn't right." Her words caught me off guard. I set my tablet aside and looked up at her. "Thank you. I appreciate that." She nodded and walked away, leaving me to my thoughts. That simple acknowledgement meant more than I expected. It was a reminder that even in the face of systemic issues, individuals could choose to do better. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken to me earlier leaned over again, his tone hushed. "I just wanted to say, what you did back there, that took guts. My daughter was watching, and she couldn't stop talking about how you stood up for yourself." His words hit me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I glanced past him and saw a little girl in the row behind us, her head peeking over the seat. She smiled shyly when our eyes met. "She's a smart girl," I said, my voice softer now. "And she deserves to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to see moments like that." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for not letting them get away with it." As he settled back into his seat, I turned to the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly into the horizon. That little girl's smile stayed with me. It reminded me why I couldn't let this moment pass without action. If I could change even one person's perception, or one organization's culture, it would be worth every second of discomfort, every stare, every whispered word. I returned to my tablet, adding the finishing touches to my memo. The words were sharper now, driven not just by professional obligation but by personal conviction. This wasn't just about an apology or a disciplinary action. This was about creating a system where no one else would have to endure what I had. As the plane began its descent, I saved the document and leaned back in my seat. The weight of the incident was still there, but so was the clarity of my purpose. I wasn't just drafting a complaint, I was building a case for change. The flight landed smoothly, and as I prepared to disembark, the lead flight attendant handed me a handwritten note. "From the gate manager," she said, her voice low. I unfolded it as I walked down the jet bridge. Miss Davis. I deeply regret the events of today and assure you they will not be overlooked. Thank you for your patience and professionalism. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything more I can do. Sincerely, James Benson. The gesture was small but meaningful. I slipped the note into my bag, knowing it was just the beginning. Words were easy, actions were harder. And I intended to ensure those actions happened. As I stepped into the bustling terminal, the chaos of the airport felt sharper now, more alive. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and walked forward, each step steady and deliberate. Today wasn't the end, it was the start of something bigger. The next morning, I walked into my office with the clarity of someone who had spent the night charting a battle plan. The sunlight streaming through the glass windows of Atlantic Air's regional headquarters felt like a promise, a reminder that light would find its way into even the darkest places. Today, I intended to shine that light on the cracks in our system. My assistant, Karen, was already waiting by my desk, holding a neatly stacked folder. "Good morning, Miss Davis. I pulled the complaints you requested," she said, her tone cautious. "It's a lot." I took the folder from her, flipping it open to glance at the first page. My stomach twisted. The complaints weren't just a lot, they were a damning portrait of neglect. Passenger grievances against employees like Miss Andrews had been filed over the years, but most had been dismissed or marked unsubstantiated. "Thank you, Karen," I said, my voice steady. "Can you make sure I'm not interrupted this morning?" She nodded but hesitated. "Miss Davis, if I may. I just wanted to say I admire what you're doing. A lot of us have seen things like what happened to you, but we've never felt we could speak up." Her words gave me pause. I met her gaze and saw the weight of unspoken stories there. "Thank you, Karen. That means more than you know. This isn't just about me, it's about ensuring no one else has to go through it." She left quietly, and I turned my attention to the documents in front of me. The pattern was glaring. Complaints of bias and discrimination were far more likely to be dismissed at major hubs than at smaller, regional airports. A chilling realization settled over me: the closer someone was to the heart of the company's operations, the less likely they were to face accountability. Miss Andrews' file painted an even darker picture. Several passengers and even colleagues had reported her dismissive and discriminatory behavior. One complaint stood out: a young black man had been denied boarding for a business-class flight despite presenting a valid ticket. Miss Andrews had claimed the passenger was hostile, and her word had been enough to close the case. The warning signs had been there, but no one had acted. The failures weren't just hers. They belonged to a system that had allowed her behavior to go unchecked. My anger simmered, not as an eruption but as a steady fire driving me forward. I couldn't let this moment pass as just another blip in the company's history. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment. The weight of the documents, the systemic neglect, and the stories they told pressed against me. But so did the memory of that little girl at the airport, watching me with wide eyes. And Karen's words: "We've never felt we could speak up." I straightened, grabbing my tablet and opening the memo I'd started drafting on the plane. The words came faster now, sharpened by the evidence before me. I outlined specific recommendations: mandatory anti-bias training, the creation of an accountability committee, and transparent processes for handling complaints. A knock at the door pulled me from my work. It was James Benson, the gate manager. He entered hesitantly, clutching a folder of his own. "Miss Davis, thank you for meeting with me," he began, his tone careful. "I wanted to share what I've found after speaking with my staff." I motioned for him to sit, and he placed the folder on my desk. "What did you uncover?" I asked. "Other gate agents have noticed patterns," he admitted, his voice heavy with discomfort. "Miss Andrews had a way of making certain passengers feel unwelcome. I should have acted sooner, but I didn't want to rock the boat. His admission was a mix of guilt and humility. It's good that you're acting now, I said, keeping my tone firm but not unkind. But this isn't just about one person. It's about creating a culture where no one feels they have to stay silent. Benson nodded, his expression somber. I understand. I'll do whatever I can to support this. As he left, I returned to my memo, my determination renewed. This wasn't just about addressing Miss Andrews' behavior, it was about uprooting the culture that had allowed it to thrive. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but I knew one thing for certain: change doesn't come from silence. And I wasn't about to stay silent. The conference room was a sea of polished wood, glass, and tension. Atlantic Air's executive team filled the seats, their faces a blend of curiosity and unease. I stood at the head of the table, my tablet in front of me and the weight of my findings pressing against my chest. Today was about more than just presenting a report. It was about holding a mirror to a system that had failed too many times. Good afternoon, I began, my voice calm but firm. As you all know, an incident occurred last week at Gate 27. While it may seem like an isolated case, the investigation has revealed a deeper issue within our organization, one that demands immediate attention. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of a chair. I tapped my tablet, projecting a series of charts onto the screen behind me. The data was stark. Complaints of discrimination were disproportionately dismissed at major hubs compared to smaller airports. Cases involving employees with repeated offenses were swept under the rug in the name of efficiency. This isn't just a PR issue, I continued, letting my gaze sweep across the room. It's a legal and ethical issue. Incidents like this not only expose us to lawsuits but erode the trust of our passengers and employees. One of the directors, an older man with graying hair and a skeptical expression, leaned forward. Miss Davis, these are serious allegations. Are you suggesting this is systemic? With all due respect, the data doesn't lie, I replied, projecting another slide. Over the past 3 years, 68% of discrimination complaints at major hubs were dismissed without investigation. Compare that to 23% at regional airports. This isn't just a pattern, it's a culture. A murmur rippled through the room. Another director, a woman known for her pragmatism, spoke up. What's your proposed solution? I clicked to the next slide, outlining my recommendations. First, we implement mandatory oversight for all complaints. Every dismissal must be reviewed by an independent accountability committee. Second, we establish a direct line for employees and passengers to report incidents to a neutral third party. Finally, we commit to quarterly reviews of complaint handling, with results shared transparently across the company. The weight of my words settled over the room. The directors exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. But as the silence stretched, the chairman of the board leaned forward, his expression grave but resolute. This will require a significant cultural shift, he said, his voice measured. But I agree it's necessary. Let's move forward with Miss Davis's recommendations. I nodded, the tension in my chest easing slightly. This was a step forward, but I knew the real work was just beginning. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my tablet and notes, feeling the faint stirrings of hope. Today, I had planted the seeds for change. Now, it was time to ensure they took root. The days that followed were a whirlwind of action and reflection. As I returned to my office, the gravity of what had unfolded at Gate 27 still weighed on me, but so did the possibility of change. The memo I had drafted was circulated company-wide, outlining not just the facts of the incident but the reforms Atlantic Air would undertake. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to optimism. A week later, I received an email marked "Confidential" from James Benson. It was a follow-up on the actions being taken against Miss Andrews. The email detailed her termination, not just for her behavior during my incident but for the pattern of misconduct uncovered during the investigation. The evidence had been overwhelming, and there was no room for leniency. Yet, Benson's email didn't just end with procedural updates. There was something more personal. Miss Davis, I want to thank you for holding us accountable. I've learned a lot from this experience, about my own biases and about what leadership truly means. It's clear to me now that I need to lead by example, and that starts with admitting where I've fallen short. I appreciate your patience and your courage. You've set a standard I aim to follow. Sincerely, James Benson. I stared at his words, letting them sink in. It wasn't just the outcome of this one case that mattered, it was the ripple effect. Benson's acknowledgement was proof that change, no matter how slow or painful, was possible. The next time I boarded a flight, the experience felt markedly different. The gate agents greeted passengers warmly, their professionalism evident in every gesture. The tension that had defined my last trip was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of mutual respect. As I settled into my seat, I spotted a familiar face, a little girl from gate 27. She was sitting a few rows back with her mother, her eyes lighting up as she recognized me. She leaned toward her mother and whispered something, her excitement visible in the way she waved at me. I smiled and gave her a small wave back. Her mother leaned forward, her expression grateful. "She's been talking about you non-stop since that day," she said. "You've inspired her more than you know." I felt a lump rise in my throat as I nodded. "She inspires me, too," I said, my voice softer than I intended. As the plane ascended, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. My mother's words echoed in my mind once again, "Grace and strength move mountains." She had been right. Change didn't come from force or anger alone, it came from persistence, from patience, from the willingness to face each challenge head-on. This wasn't the end of my fight, but it was a victory worth savoring. For myself. For the little girl who now dreamed bigger. For every passenger who had ever felt unseen or unwelcome. And for the future I was determined to build.